Thank you for the song this morning. We will be turning to Isaiah chapter 42. So in our series through the book of Isaiah, this is now message number 52, entitled The Elect Servant. And we're going to be looking at chapter 42 and verses 1 through 9. Behold my servant whom I uphold, mine elect in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. He shall not fail, nor be discouraged, till he have set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. Thus saith God the Lord, He that created the heavens and stretched them out, He that spread forth the earth and that which cometh out of it, He that giveth breath unto the people upon it, and spirit to them that walk therein. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another, neither my praise to graven images. Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. So chapters 40 to 48 is the first section of part 2 of Isaiah. And this section focuses on the return from exile, even though the exile itself was still over a century away from when this was written. Now, these chapters are oftentimes well known for the fact that there is a high exaltation of God in these chapters. It's very thematic in these chapters, as well as probably the most extensive scorn and mockery of idols and the denouncing of idols. So here in this part of Isaiah, in these few chapters, you have really some of the deepest Old Testament theology of God in these particular chapters. So the return from exile and the role of Cyrus in that return is certainly featured in this section. But the far future ultimate return from exile is what is in view, which means there is obviously a strong focus on the Messiah. Now, chapter 41 continued exalting the greatness of God, showing how that God orders history and He accomplishes His purpose. None of the nations can hinder Him. None of the nations can thwart His purpose. None of the nations can overcome what He has determined to be done. Now, the return from exile under Cyrus, while that is not the full eschatological return, that return under Cyrus, we saw in chapter 41, was to be a sign to Israel and a sign to the nations, that God will not cast away His nation that He has chosen from Abraham. And so this reassurance continues throughout this section, and it's an important part of the messianic prophecies that we have in part 2 of Isaiah. Well, now we come to chapter 42, and chapter 42 is continuing from chapters 40 and 41 before them, but perhaps in a little bit of a surprising way. So chapter 41 ends with a strong denunciation of the idols as being nothing and trust in them as utter folly. But following immediately after that denunciation of the idols, we get the presentation of the servant of Yahweh. That is how chapter 42 starts. Now, think about an idol for a moment. An idol is an image that Israel was forbidden to make or to worship according to the Old Covenant, places like Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 to 6. And so what we find as we study in the Scriptures is that there is only one image of God, and that is the servant of Yahweh, Jesus Christ the Son. And that is stated explicitly in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 3 that we studied a while back. So this is a presentation of the image of God to Israel. And this is an introduction of this title for the Messiah. Isaiah uses a few different titles, and here he begins to use the servant of Yahweh, which will continue in this second part. So from here to the end of Isaiah, we have Yahweh's servant. We have him in humiliation. We have him in rejection by Israel. We have him in death. We have him in exaltation. We have him as returning king. We have him as gatherer and restorer of Israel. We have him as establisher of the kingdom. And we have him as reigning over all the earth from Zion. That's from here again to the end of Isaiah. Well, the first part that we're looking at here, chapter 42 and verses 1 to 9. And this is actually the first of what has come to be known, and I forget, I knew the name of the scholar, I think, that was the first one to use this name, but it's very prevalent now. What these have come to be known are the servant songs. So here in chapter 42, verses 1 to 9, is the first of these servant songs. There's 4 of them here in Isaiah in this second part. These servant songs, they've been called that because they are special poetic prophecies of the Messiah. And as I said, there are 4 of them. So here in chapter 42, verses 1 to 9. The next is in chapter 49, verses 1 to 13. The third is in chapter 50, verses 4 to 11. And the fourth begins at the end of chapter 52 with verse 12 and runs all the way through chapter 53 and verse 12. Yes, chapter 53, that probably the most well-known chapter in Isaiah and maybe even in all of the Old Testament, is the fourth of the servant songs. Now, when you look at these servant songs, we can discern that each of them has a particular message pertaining to the Messiah. So the first one speaks of the Messiah and his coming to establish justice over all of the earth and to enlighten those that are darkened. In other words, those in spiritual blindness. In the second, it's the coming of the Messiah to restore Israel and to reach the nations. In the third, it focuses on the humiliation and rejection of the Messiah. And the fourth, his exaltation and providing atonement through death. So we're going to look at this first servant song, and we're going to look at it in 2 parts. Verses 1 to 4, where God essentially declares, "Behold my servant," and verses 5 to 9, where he speaks as to the servant, a covenant, that he is a covenant for the nation. So we'll start here again with verse number 1. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles." Now, the very term servant that is used here, Ebed, it is a word that means a bondman, a bondservant, a slave. In fact, it is equivalent to the Greek doulos that is so commonly used in the New Testament. Now, when God speaks of his servant, he has referred to a few as his servant. In fact, he spoke of Isaiah as his servant back in chapter 20 and verse 3. He spoke of Eliakim, who would be his servant there in the time of Hezekiah, chapter 22 and verse number 20. He spoke of David as being his servant, chapter 37 and verse 35. And he also has spoken of Israel as his servant, and will continue to do so. That started back in chapter 41, verses 8 to 9. And it's important to see that reference there to Israel as his servant, because we have specifically mentioned Jacob and the seed of Abraham. So in other words, there's no question as to the identity of Israel as the servant of God. Now, this title as the servant or even the slave of Yahweh, it is a designation of humility. It is a title that speaks of humility. It is a title that puts us in mind of one that is in subjection to another, not one of high rank, not one of high glory, not one of high esteem. And that is exactly what we see reflected in that character. Of course, as we find out, this particular servant is also the king. A servant is one who is totally beholden to the will and the direction of another. And so Isaiah uses this title as a designation, a title for the Messiah. And it occurs here. It occurs several more times in Isaiah in the second part. Now, one thing we do have to exercise some caution because, as I said, Israel is also called God's servant and several times. And we do have to be careful to maintain that distinction and that context. One of the things that you will find is many of those in the replacement theologies, they like to conflate these two together, that Israel as servant and Christ as servant and Christ as Israel. And they like to just conflate all that together. And one of the reasons why is because from there they spiritualize those inheritance promises to Israel and essentially turn them into some sort of spiritual fulfillment in the first coming of Christ, and just basically do away with promises of restoration and such for Israel nationally and ethnically. So we do have to be careful to keep these things straight. But also note that in verses 1 to 4 here are quoted by Matthew as a direct messianic prophecy, a direct prophecy of Jesus Christ. Matthew quotes it, speaking of Jesus, as Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 to 21. And we'll look at those in just a moment. But we know that also Paul picked up on this usage in Isaiah as well, in that famous section in Philippians chapter 2, particularly in verse number 7, where he speaks of Jesus Christ as humbling himself, and humbling himself to become a man, first of all, to take on human flesh. He humbled himself. But not only that, he also humbled himself as a man to become a slave, to become a doulos, and to be obedient even unto his own death at the will of his master. So Paul picks up on Isaiah's language and depiction of the Messiah as the servant of Yahweh. He reflects that language in Philippians chapter number 2, talking about Jesus. And again, Matthew speaks of this as a direct prophecy of Jesus Christ and of him fulfilling it, particularly in his first coming. And we'll see a little bit more about that in just a moment. But even Jesus himself, during his time, during his ministry on the earth, he testified that he had no will of his own. This is the language and the mind of a slave. He had no will of his own. His only will, he said, was to do the will of him that sent him, his Father. And he said such things like in John chapter 5, verse 30, chapter 6, verse 38. So in other words, Jesus fully acknowledged and embraced this role as the servant or the slave of Yahweh. Now, what we're told back in verse 1 particularly is that Yahweh upholds, sustains, keeps, and helps his servant. And we're going to see that is going to be echoed later in Isaiah in chapter 49 and 50 in particular. But notice also that his servant that he's speaking about is chosen by God and beloved. Now, of course, this reminds us of Matthew chapter 3 and verse number 17 and the baptism of Jesus, that he's given the Spirit. He's anointed with the Spirit without measure. And of course, Isaiah has already prophesied about this back in chapter number 11, and he will do so again in chapter number 61. So this speaks about him bringing forth judgment to the nations, to the Goyim. And of course, this last phrase speaks about his reign on the earth. And again, this is an area where we're going to see that blending of first and second comings without any indication of a gap. However, you will see here that something has to happen, because how can you put these things together? How can you put his humiliation, his rejection, his sufferings, even his death, with what seems to be his success of establishing justice over all the nations of the earth? And so obviously we can read it and looking back at it now, we can certainly see there are definitely distinctions here between a first and a second coming. But again, those weren't as clear until Revelation progressed. So the extents of his reign are again described as the whole earth. And his reign will bring perfect justice throughout the world, a righteous government where sin will be swiftly punished. He's depicted in some places as ruling with a rod of iron. And this, of course, will be a cause of great blessing and great joy, as we will see a little later. Verse number 2. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. Now, again, verses 2 and 3 are going to be those that seem to not quite go along with what's said at the end of verse number 1. It seems like his coming means his success, kingdom over all the nations of the earth. And now we're talking about meekness and that sort of thing. Well, these two verses, they really do describe the humility of the Messiah, the meekness of the Messiah. And so this brings us back to an important context. Matthew, again, quotes these first 4 verses. He uses them in reference to Jesus as being fulfilled in that ministry of Jesus. So pay attention to this context. This is Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 to 21. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from thence, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all, and charged them that they should not make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench, till he send forth judgment unto victory, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. So if you noticed Matthew's context, and as you're studying through Matthew's gospel and his particular arrangement, by this point, the rejection of Jesus has already taken place. In other words, by this point, the leaders of Israel are already conspiring how to kill him. They're no longer questioning, is this some sort of special prophet? Could this be the Messiah? Is this the son of David? They're not asking those kind of questions. They're simply asking, what is going to be the most convenient way to do away with him? They're already planning his crucifixion, his execution at this point. They have rejected him. And you'll notice verse 15, there speaks about Jesus knew it. He knew what was in the heart and the mind of those leaders of Israel. And what does it say? It says, he withdrew himself. And immediately after that, he healed many of them, but he charged them not to make him known. And Matthew says that he did this in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy right here, that he would not cry and lift up his voice in the streets and make a clamor and seek a following whatsoever. So that is what this has to do with. When the Messiah first came, some 700 years after this was written, he came humbly and he came without clamoring. And this prophecy has to do with his withdrawal. Now, look also at verse 3. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. This is certainly a precious verse, and one that I'm afraid does get some abuse, because some seem to read this and get the idea that Jesus will not judge sin, that this is just gentle Jesus that will not judge sin. And we have already had prophecies and depictions of his coming in judgment, in the fury of his wrath in his second coming. So again, we have to understand that there is a distinction here between the first coming of Jesus and the second coming. When he came into the world the first time, it wasn't to judge the world. It wasn't to condemn the world. Why? Because the world's already condemned, is what John said in John chapter 3. He didn't come for that purpose. He came to save. In other words, he came to fulfill the old covenant law. He came to offer himself as a sacrifice for sins in order to save all of those who believe, who trust in him. So again, verse 3, precious verse. And Jesus is merciful and gracious, and he is gentle, and he is meek, and he is lowly, and he does receive those who come to him. But this verse is not telling us that Jesus does not judge sin, and that he will not rule with a rod of iron, bringing swift punishment against any wrongdoing. He will. What is this word? Well, primarily, this is a word to the Jews in exile. It is a word that is acknowledging their condition, the smoking wick and so on. This is the condition of Israel in their weakness. And this has been described already in Isaiah. It's a promise, it's a reassurance that he's not going to destroy them. Yes, they might be just a smoldering wick, but he's not going to snuff them out entirely. He will gather and he will restore them. So this is again a reference to his kingdom. Notice that time marker there. He will not do it until, and that's just the way that Matthew quoted, until he brings forth judgment unto truth. So until he comes, in the coming of his kingdom, this is referring to his second coming, until he comes in his second coming, he's not going to destroy Israel totally. He's going to gather and restore. Yes, he's going to destroy those unbelieving. So verses 2 and 3 primarily have to do with his first coming. And Matthew said he fulfilled these verses in his first coming. Now verse 4 goes on, he shall not fail nor be discouraged till he have set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. Well, he will not fail. Yahweh's servant will not fail. Now, that's an interesting thing to say. In fact, why would it even say that? Well, again, when we understand his coming in humility, his rejection, his suffering, even his death, that looks like failure. If we don't understand God's word, it looks like Jesus failed. Or this Jesus of Nazareth that showed up to those of Israel looked like a failure. He's not gathering a following. In fact, he's withdrawing. He's charging people not to speak of him. His followers are being dispersed. He looks like a failure, but here's the word. He's not going to fail. And we also get this prophecy until he has set judgment in the earth. In other words, this is the beginning, so to speak, of his work in his first coming. It's also a prophecy of the Messiah as a lawgiver. The isles, the islands, the extents, those coastlands, those, in other words, nations that are more outlying beyond just regionally close to Israel. So it's a prophecy of the Messiah's lawgiver, referring, of course, to the new covenant law of Christ that we saw beginning with the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, completed with his apostles. Now we come to the second part, verses 5 to 9, and this is where God now is speaking to his servant, speaking to the Messiah, and is speaking of giving him as a covenant for the nation. Thus saith God the Lord, he that created the heavens and stretched them out, he that spread forth the earth and that which cometh out of it, he that giveth breath unto the people upon it, and spirit to them that walk therein. So God is speaking here, as it were, to Christ, and he's emphasizing his sovereign creatorship. He's created the heavens and so on. And at times in Isaiah, yes, he will speak of Israel as being his servant, but he will also speak of creating Israel. Now, this servant of Yahweh that he's talking about here, he'll never speak of creating him, because he is the Lord. He is the Son. He's the part of the Trinity. He's the Messiah. He's God. Now, speaking as a creator obviously signifies his power, his control, his governance, and the ability to do what he says will be done. In other words, this apparent failure of the Messiah, this what looks like such a setback, is still under God's control. It's not a setback at all, and he's sending his servant in order to do all of these things. Verse 6 says, I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, and for a light of the Gentiles. So his servant is his chosen, his elect, and he is chosen in a righteous purpose. That's what's being expressed here. And that righteous purpose is the salvation of Israel and the salvation of the nations. Now, previously we saw back in verse 1, speaking about him helping of the Messiah, and you think then directly to what that blasphemy of the Holy Spirit was with the Pharisees back earlier in chapter 12 of Matthew as well, where they were speaking of his help as coming from Satan. In other words, God says, I'll put my spirit upon him, and they were effectively rejecting that and saying, You have a spirit, but it's not the Spirit of God. It's the spirit of Satan. And that is what Jesus referred to as the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, for which there is no forgiveness. But also, he is given for a covenant after the giving of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was already given, and the Old Covenant already had a mediator. And we studied this recently in Hebrews, and you can reread part of chapter number 8 there to just sort of refresh on it. He's the mediator of the new covenant. This is what's being referred to here. He's given for a new covenant for Israel and Judah. And the new covenant does what the old could not, in essence, forgive sins, bring about the fulfillment of the covenant with Abraham and David, which the old covenant could not do. Now notice in this verse, he would be given for a covenant of the people. And this is in the singular, and it is Am. It is the word for nation, and it is in the singular. And then Gentiles is the plural, and it's Goyim, the word for nations. Clearly, this is talking about a covenant for Israel and for a light for the nations. Verse 7, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. Deliverance from the blindness and the bondage of sin is being spoken of. And we had just, we had just a foretaste of this in his first coming, in his incarnation. So this refers more fully to his coming kingdom, to Israel's restoration, when he will loose them from captivity in exile, and he will open their eyes. Verse number 8, I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another, neither my praise to graven images. The Lord is Yahweh, eternal, self-existent one. And this verse obviously expresses even the deity of the Messiah. God will not share or divide glory with images, but only his image, his one true image, his Son, will he glory in. So this is just like Jesus spoke about in places like John chapter 5, I think verse number 23. There's this honor between Father and Son, this reciprocal honor between the different members of the Trinity. And it's something difficult for us to comprehend, but it does exist. And God states very plainly, I will not divide glory with idols. I will not divide glory with nations. I will not divide glory with these images. I'll not divide glory with men or with angels. Verse number 9. Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. So God essentially says he is God alone, and he does what no other can. The former things refers to past prophecies that have been fulfilled, and that should cause trust in him. And new things primarily refers to the work of the Messiah as being foretold, as the revelation is continuing to progress and other prophecies are being made. And he says that he tells them before they happen. He even speaks of them as if they've already happened in sometimes. And so we should remember those former things that have been fulfilled and come to pass, and trust him for those new things that have already been given, but they have yet to be fulfilled. So ultimately, the message that we have is that Israel will be saved. It's not going to be destroyed. Will be saved. It's going to be through the coming of Yahweh's servant. It's going to be through his giving of himself for them. And it's not going to be through any of the works of men's hands. So what we have in this first servant song is really a message of comfort and a message of reassurance. These prophecies of the coming of the Messiah in meekness apply particularly to his first coming, but we see sprinkled in there as well some references that apply to his second coming. His first coming, again, in some ways looked like a failure, but we're told here that the servant of Yahweh will not fail. We're told that specifically, explicitly, which seems kind of odd. Why would that be stated? Well, because his first coming did look like that to the undiscerning, to those spiritually blind. But we're reassured here, he will not fail. And his coming is the signal of God's purpose in motion. In other words, he has already come. So there's no reason. There's no reason to question that he's going to return. That all the rest, all these new things that have already been given but haven't yet been fulfilled, that they will be, because all of the old things have been fulfilled. All of the former things have been fulfilled. He will not fail until he brings justice over all nations of this earth from Zion. All right, now we'll stop here and we will close with a hymn.